Today we're in an early JKU. It's not a Rubicon, and a lot of you guys that buy Rubicons and then swap out the axles and sway bar and everything else are kind of throwing your money away. This is a relatively plain Jane 2007 JK 4-door, and it's unusual in that this customer built his own suspension. He used some square tube. He bought some Dana 60 axles from Mopar, and he's got E-lockers in them. So we're going to wire up some locker switches. Having independent locker switches of the operating system means that you can use those lockers anytime you want, front or rear. So you got to be careful. You don't want to engage a locker on the highway, but at the same time it'll allow you to engage the front locker when you need front digs, or you can engage the rear locker in two-wheel drive high, which is one benefit over the stock system, which forces you to run the rear locker first, then the front locker, and you're restricted to four-wheel drive low, under about 18 miles an hour. But getting back to this build, this has got an LT1 with an 8-speed in it, and I think you guys know that this is not only a phenomenal combination, but the future. We started doing LT swaps almost 2 years ago, and back then everything was R&D, just like it was back in 2007 and 8 when we started working on the Gen 4 LSs. But we've gotten to the point now where we've done dozens and dozens of these LT builds, and they're getting rationalized not only through our shop but through General Motors. General Motors has made a lot of improvements to both the transmission and the engines. The LT3, the LT6, and the LT1 are pretty much the staple. LT3 being the 5.3, LT6 being the truck 6.2, and the LT1 being the passenger car or Corvette Camaro 6.2. The LT1 has the advantage of being available new, has a lower intake so that you can run it in smaller chassis or smaller engine compartments. So we like to go with the LT1. Many years ago, the LT1 was really expensive. It was a production engine, and GM just wasn't making a lot of them. The price was up there. But over the last couple of years, the LT1 has just come down and down and down in price. And the reality is you can pick up an LT1 now for about the same price or less than an LS3. And if you consider the technology in this engine with the direct injection, the continuous variable valve timing, and all the other technology that went into it, it really is an amazing value. And then when you combine that with an 8-speed transmission, it just doesn't get any better than that. And I think that's what this video comes down to, is I've really seen powertrains go from the 3.8 4-speed, which is really a carryover from the 1980s, 200 horsepower-ish with 200 foot-pounds of torque in this giant JK. And then of course, the superchargers and turbochargers and Hemis and LSs came out, and all of them added power, but nothing has added power, in my opinion, like these LTs. These LTs, especially with the 8-speed and hopefully soon the 10-speed, just change the playing field. It's a game changer. These LTs get pretty decent economy, in general better than the V6s did. The heavier the JK, the better you're going to see your mileage improvement. And these engines just don't cost a lot. If you look at an LT3 in a wrecking yard, you can pick them up for a song today versus just a few years ago. And I know that the Hemis and the LSs are dropping in price, but the reality is you're just not getting the technology that we're getting here. When you compare the technology, then what it comes down to is value. To get a high compression, all aluminum, direct injected CVVT motor for the price that the LT3 is going for is just unheard of in the engine swap world of the past. And that translates to real life drivability. You can't feel what I'm feeling driving this vehicle. I can only try to explain to you how easily and how effortless these LTs move these heavy JKs. It really is a different experience. Now don't get me wrong, the LSs move these JKs just fine, but in a different way. The LSs were more traditional. You got off the line, you wound the engine up into its power band, then it started to pull. Same thing as a Hemi. Sure, you can go to a bigger engine, you can go to a 7-liter, 454, whatever, and get more torque, but the beauty of the LT is that they got that torque without sacrifice. They did not make the engine larger. We're still running a 6.2-liter engine and a 5.3-liter engine, but we're putting out unheard of torque on the bottom end. So what that boils down to is that we can take a crate engine like an LT3 or an LT1, outperform its predecessors. In fact, I'd put my money on an LT1 versus any of the LS3 crate motors, but we're doing it with an engine that still idles at 500 RPM, an engine that can still run on low-grade gas, at least as far as the truck engines are concerned. GM does recommend premium gas in the higher performance engines. And my take on that is this: these engines have high compression, they have very efficient combustion chambers, and they have direct injection. They also have continuous variable valve timing, which allows better and more precise control of the combustion chamber pressure. So that means you can almost get away with a lower grade fuel, because with ultra-fast NOx sensors and the fact that you can retard the cam and lower that pressure, in that sense you can run the higher grade fuels. However, there is no free lunch. And what that means is if you're going to take your JK up to Colorado, go over the pass with a trailer, just run premium gas. You need that extra horsepower. But if you're at sea level in Miami or in Los Angeles and you're running a JK with 35-inch tires and you have very little weight, you can go ahead and put mid-grade in it, and on the truck engines just put regular in it. I run regular in the 5.3s all the time. So what we're getting is we're getting an engine that can run on lower grade fuel with high compression and performance of the previous crate motor. And as I said, there is no free lunch. So in the past, manufacturers are building horsepower through camshafts and other technologies that really compromise drivability, and that's where the LT is different. The LT is not compromising drivability. Now we all know that we can add a blower, you can do a Hellcat, you can do an LT4, and that will add horsepower without really affecting drivability. But the cost of that blower, the operating system and all the other components that go along with it, the intercooler and the wastegate control and all that, are not as simple as just a regular old normally aspirated engine. So what GM has done here is they've taken a normally aspirated engine and they basically maintain the drivability of a mild engine that will idle at 500-600 RPM, but then they added the performance of the high horsepower crate motors of just a few years ago. So you get the best of both worlds. You get the drivability, you get the performance, and you get the economy. And we are running up against a wall, which means we're only going to get so much energy out of a gallon of gasoline. I'm a believer that there's still some energy left in the exhaust, because a lot of the energy that's created in an engine goes out the exhaust as heat, and I think that we can use that heat, recycle it, regenerate it, but that's another video. However, when it comes to the average passenger car that manufacturers can build, or SUVs, we're pretty much reaching the limit. From the 1970s to today, which is about the time period that I've been doing engine swap, these engines have gone from relatively inefficient. Combustion chamber efficiency was not that good in the old days, but then we had hydrocarbons and COs and NOx to deal with. So in the 70s we had all sorts of apparatus to try to handle that. We had EGR valves to recirculate the exhaust gas, we had secondary air systems, we had catalytic converters, we had all these emission systems because the engines just weren't that clean. These LTs run extremely clean. There is no more EGR valve, there is no more secondary air systems. Yes, we run a purge valve and an evap system because we have to. We have to store gasoline on the vehicle. And when you store gasoline, you have gasoline vapors. There's no way around that. But they've essentially got the emissions to the point that the parts per million and the percentile of emissions that are coming out the tailpipe. So we got to look at other ways to improve engine performance. They've done a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the LS has started that. When we went from the old small block and big block to the Gen 3 LS, it was a huge improvement in economy and performance. We were still burdened with the 4-speed transmissions, but still, we were seeing the 5.3 LSs not only outperform, but get much better economy than the old small blocks like the K motors, the throttle body motors, even the later sequential injected motors. In 1996, the feds required independent cylinder monitoring for cylinder shutdown. So the small block Chevy did get a short time of sequential fuel injection, but still, the architecture was 40 years old. The combustion chamber technology was not there. They were iron engine. They just couldn't compete with the LS. The Gen 4 took the Gen 3 motor another step by adding variable valve timing, but I think more importantly, they added the 6-speed transmission. I'm really starting to appreciate the benefit of these high gear transmissions. When the first 8 speeds came out, I was somewhat disappointed, not only the ones from General Motors, but the ones from Dodge. They always seemed to be shifting. They had some timers, alt timers for transmissions. They really didn't know what gear they wanted to be in. You could be cruising up a hill and it would upshift and lug the motor down, and then you'd be going down the hill and it would downshift. So it just kind of didn't make sense. But I think in the last couple of years, they've really sorted that, and I'm driving this 8-speed right now. Now, I will say that I'm running a 8L90. It's new production, probably 2019, and it's running an T87A controller, which means that's the new version of the T87. And what I noticed about this controller is it shifts beautiful. However, it does take a little bit of time for it to learn. These transmissions have what they call characterization or adaptives, like you would like to think in the past. And what that means is as you drive it and you shift it, in fact, one of the things GM recommends is that you manually upshift and downshift the transmission to learn the solenoid characterization. And as you drive it, it gets smoother and smoother. And depending on how you drive it, if you drive it like a gorilla, it's going to shift like a gorilla. If you drive it like grandma, it's going to shift for grandma. So these transmissions are really intelligent, and they have added immensely to engine performance. And don't overlook that. You can take the most efficient engine and stick a 4-speed behind it. In fact, the 3.8 liter JK engine really wasn't that bad of an engine, but when it was burdened with the weight of a JK and then the 45 RFE, which really an inefficient transmission that robbed horsepower, what you were left with was not very much. So to make a comparison, if you look at the new JL with a ZF 8-speed, I think you can see that the 3.6 has taken a leap in performance, and it's not because they really changed the Pentastar that much, because they changed changed the transmission. When they went from the 5-speed to the 8-speed, it allows that little 3.6-liter engine to perform in its power band. It downshifts and it revs up. It's not like a V8 where it's going to pull you at low RPM. But at the same time, it allows that engine to get into its power band. So when you take that 8-speed, 10-speed, and you put it in behind a V8, now we're approaching the pinnacle of performance versus economy. Because now we have an engine that has tremendous torque available to it. And I know you guys have heard me say this a lot of times, that the LT is halfway to a diesel. And I mean it. When you drive this vehicle, and if you drive a diesel, you'd say, yeah, it's somewhere in between. I'm just cruising along here. The lightest touch of the throttle accelerates this heavy JK. We got 40s, we got 1-ton axles. This guy built his own suspension system out of square steel tubing, the heavy JK. Yet this LT1 with an 8-speed makes it feel like a go-kart. It's a sensation that you really couldn't get in the old days. Now, again, LS's and the Hemis feel awesome to me. Growing up through that era, I was programmed that a high-performance engine has a rumpity-rump idle, has a soggy bottom end, and then you get your power on the top end. And when I drive an LS, it feels more like that to me. You get into the throttle and the transmission downshifts and you take off, and that's a great feeling. However, with this LT, you really got to rethink the way engine performance works. With this LT, you get on the throttle and it instantly takes off. It doesn't downshift, it doesn't rev up, it just pulls you forward. After driving these LTs now for a couple of years, I can say that I'm spoiled. And I can also say that while I love the 6.2, I'm not really sure that I need it. If I were to put a LT in my personal Jeep, I might just stick with a 5.3. Actually, that's what I put in my personal JL, is a 5.3 L83. And it's really fast, faster than I need it to be. Now, I've got small tires on it. We're going to bump the tires up, but I've driven plenty of JKs with large tires and 5.3 L83s and have always been impressed that it's never lacked. Even going up the grade at altitude, the 5.3 can pull it. It's just enough for a heavy JK with large tires. If you want more than that, you can get yourself a 6.2 LT1, and in my opinion, you don't need any more than that. Now you say, well, is there more than that? And there is, of course, the LT4, the LT5, and it's deceiving because the LT1 at 460 horsepower, in my opinion, outperforms most of the 500 horsepower motor, especially with the 8-speed transmission. So when you compare a 660 horsepower LT4 to the competition, I really think it's up there with the 700 to 750 horsepower engine. Now with a 10-speed transmission and an LT5, it's just going to be insane. One of the things that you have to consider with these high-performance engines is fueling. The LT4 has 8 direct injectors, which gets you close to 700 horsepower. With the LT5, they needed more horsepower than that. Now remember, GM has decided to go to direct injection, which has brought a whole slew of technology along with it. If we were running the old-fashioned style injectors, port injectors or sequential port injectors, then it would have been easy just to increase the injector pulse width and get more fuel into it. But we're kind of slave to this direct injection, and I'm glad that we are, because the benefits that go along with direct injection are many. So what they did in the LT5 is they actually installed an extra set of port fuel injectors in the intake. So when the blower comes in and you get into boost, it adds that extra fuel. Remember, when we're starting to put out 700, 800, 900 horsepower, we got to make sure that engine has fueling. If it doesn't, first the oxygen is going to burn the fuel. Next thing, it's going to burn whatever's left, including an exhaust valve or other engine components. So we got to keep that in mind. So what GM has done with the LT4 and the LT5 is they're trying to keep these engines running for hundreds of thousands of miles in real-world conditions. It's over 100 degrees out right now. I'm taking this heavy Jeep to the mountain, and I'm going to drive it hard. And this engine has to not only hold together, it has to hold together for year after year after year. So while you might be able to get short-term power, long-term power can be more challenging. So I guess the crux of this video is we've been doing this now for 2.5 years on the LT. I think we were the first shop to really properly integrate the LT and get full functionality, things like air conditioning, cruise control, and it's a great time because growing up in the 70s was the era where engine performance was killed by legislation, by emissions, by insurance company. Now you really can't blame them because if you look at the 1960s, horsepower just increased, and by the late 1960s we had 400 horsepower engines in vehicles with drum brake, really poor steering. And not only that, we were putting big camshafts in these engines, and they were rump, and they were just blowing pollutants into the atmosphere. So something had to be done. The knee-jerk reaction in the 1970s was to lower compression and burden the engines with emissions control devices. And I remember in the late 1970s and 80s, you could barely see the engine through all the emission control devices, especially the imports like the Asian engines. They had so many hoses and aspirator valves and tubes and pulse air systems that it just choked the motors down. Well, something had to be done. I think we took a lesson from the imports, both the Europeans and the Asians, and that was, instead of building stealing a boat anchor of an engine and then trying to clean it up afterwards by reducing engine performance. Let's build an engine from the ground up that's designed to put out low emissions, and that's exactly what these new engines are. The combustion chamber technology, the cam phasing, the compression ratios all lend themselves well to low output emissions, and then really the catalytic converters can clean up what's left. So when properly set up, these engines are not only putting out a lot of horsepower, but they're clean and they're getting pretty good efficiency. The average customer of mine reports that they're getting 2 to 3 miles to the gallon better than they were. Now I have to qualify that statement. If you were to drive your vehicle the same speed as you drove the V6, you should see a mile per gallon increase. Problem is, with the V6, a lot of guys can't even go the speed limit, so when they get into the V8, they do go the speed limit, which means they go faster, and then they get similar or slightly better mileage than the V6. But apples for apples, you should be getting better mileage, and the heavier the JK, the bigger that spread should be. When I first started doing the videos on the Gen 5s, we talked about some of the teething issues the engines had and some updates that needed to be done. But now we're at a point where GM has cranked millions of these things out. They're not only putting them in passenger cars, but the truck SUV line, they're coming out with a heavy-duty 3/4 1-ton Gen 5 iron-blocked engine. I think GM has just really got these things sorted, and I think that now that we have dozens and dozens of these under our belt, that we're very comfortable with them in the operating systems. Flip side to this is the operating systems, and in 14, 15, they weren't so bad, but with the 8-speed transmission, they weren't that good. 16, 17, lots of improvements were made. Just like in 2010, the original LSs in 7 and 8 had a lot of teething issues, oiling problems, air fuel management problems. Even the 6L80 had some slippage and oiling problems. But by 2010, GM pretty much nailed it. And I can say that from 2010 to 14, the LS engines are really solid engines. So the LT is getting rationalized. I think it's getting to the point where you have to make a decision. Do you want old technology? Do you want a 5-speed transmission that doesn't have direct injection or continuous VVT? Do you want a lower compression engine? Or do you want to be future-proof for the next 5 to 10 years? These engines are just at the beginning. Not just blowers, but intakes and exhaust systems. There's going to be improvements right across the board. And I think that we're going to see horsepower numbers and economy numbers that we've never seen before. I can only imagine what these engines would put out for economy if we were running lean cruise. Lean cruise is an open loop mode where we can actually reduce the amount of fuel going to the engine. So we can run high air fuel ratios, like let's say 16, 17, even 18 to 1. And that can improve economy 15, 20, 30%. Lean cruise has been banned in North America. It can also be difficult on the engine and the exhaust system, especially the catalytic converters running that lean. So we're right up against the wall right now. I think that we've increased the technology to the point that there's not a whole lot left to be had. Yeah, we could probably go to a dual cam in these LTs, and GM actually did experiment with a cam in cam, so that we could control both intake and exhaust valves independently. But they determined that the downside outweighed the benefits. The complexity of the system, the fact that the engine had to be larger and longer to accommodate the extra timing chain. GM just stuck with a single cam, and I'm kind of glad they did, because if you look at the performance of these simple overhead valve engines, you look at the Corvette, it's right out there competing with the world best engines, and we're talking about double overhead cam, V12 Ferraris and Lamborghinis, and this simple overhead valve V8, Z06, a ZL1, whatever it is right out there performing with them. A lot less components, much simpler operation, and you can't even compare the cost. When you can buy a Corvette for under $100,000 that'll run with a $500,000 Ferrari, I think that says it all right there. So we're going to take this 2007 4-door JK up to the mountain. Let's see how it does with this hand-built suspension. And we got a lot more LT swaps coming up, guys. In fact, I think right now we've only got 2 or 3 LS builds in the shop, and the rest are LTs. And we've got 5.3s, 6.2 supercharged engines. We got the whole gamut. Stay tuned.